This is the podcast that doesn't really believe in separating art from the artist.
So if you think this podcast is bad, don't meet us as people.
I
But this couldn't really be considered art, hopefully.
don't think it could be considered
Yeah,
that.
I'd like to think my art would be different than podcasting.
Yeah,
Like, is that good
I'm.
enough?
That's good enough, I think. And if it's not, we can deal with it later, I
If
guess.
it's not, our listeners should know by now to lower your standards. This is
Exactly.
season two. We're all tired.
I'm in grad school now. I'm not as fucking free as I was.
Yeah, so give us grace. Hopefully, this conversation interests you. If not, you can always just pause it and not listen anymore. Just quiet quit, like all of us Gen Zers do, because we are ruining the economy and
Yeah.
all of the globe. So, this is Unlivable Cultures. Unlivable Cultures is a podcast making with and borrowing from anthropology, social theory, and other forms of knowledge for a more livable world. My name is Clayton. I use he, him pronouns, and today I am joined by,
I'm Julia Coverdale, and I use they, them pronouns.
and we are the duo today because Cody is gallivanting in Europe. So we're talking about art, which we don't know much about, but we do like Hannah Gadsby. So we're talking about Hannah Gadsby and art and their cool shenanigans. There were a ton of reviews,
Mm-hmm.
a ton of reviews about its Pab-lomatic,
Yeah.
Picasso According to Hannah Gadsby. I thought I was going to come across a lot of punny titles for like articles and reviews and
Nobody,
stuff.
no one's being funny about it.
No one is. And it's just like, ah, my gosh, why not? There's so many opportunities. I've only seen like one or two take that opportunity. Otherwise, they're just like serious art critics adjusting their glasses. I found one headline of a review that was punny, and it was the first one I clicked on, so I was assuming there would be a lot of clever ones, but there wasn't, sadly. It's from Art News, and the review is titled Hannah Gadsby's Disastrous Pablo-matic Show at the Brooklyn Museum has some problems of its own. But
Well,
so I guess three main things I'm thinking about talking about is Hannah Gadsby, Picasso, and then it's Pablo-matic. Yeah, so Hannah Gadsby, I guess to give a little introduction, is an Australian comedian. They now identify as gender queer. So I think as of this year, 2023, they're using they, them pronouns. They've come out with quite a few Netflix specials. They came out with Nanette, and then a couple years later, a special called Douglas, which I also thought was really funny. And then this year they came out with something special where they talked about proposing to their partner. And then they also came out with a book in 2022, I believe, called 10 Steps to Nanette, a memoir situation, which kind of, as you can guess, goes over their life up to Nanette and kind of their journey being queer in Australia, which is very anti-queer and anti-trans. Also, they have shared that they were diagnosed late in life with autism spectrum disorder. So they identify as on the spectrum, and they talk about that quite a bit in the Douglas special. Nanette is a lot about some hard hitting stuff of power, reputation, patriarchy, art history, sexual assault, misogyny, patriarchy. I said that one. All that kind of stuff. So fun things. Yeah, do you have any thoughts about Hannah Gadsby you want to share?
I just I remember us watching Nanette together as a club, and I just remember, especially the first half, like really really hitting home with my experiences like as a non-binary lesbian. I don't think I knew I was non-binary at the time. And then I remember very distinctly like the very severe tonal shift that occurs in Nanette that is so impactful and I think so reflective of the way that like women are kind of taught to compartmentalize like their experiences as like something that can be like made light of as well, but then not acknowledging or wanting to like not being allowed to discuss like the trauma also of those moments.
Yeah, I think that's a really key part of Nanette, and they talk about that with like the device that they use of like you can't tell a complete story with comedy, so they use like a excuse throughout the whole show saying that they're going to quit comedy because with comedy your stories kind of get caught up with only being in two parts, the beginning and the punchline. Whereas for actual stories and narratives, you have the beginning, the middle, and the end, or, that kind of arc for the narrative. So the fact that they kind of switched that up and they, like you said, there's a very severe tonal shift where they're joking and doing the regular comedian thing. And then they're like, but I've got to quit comedy because there's some real issues here. And they kind of use the art form itself. And I think it's really interesting. I also wrote about this while I was in college, but they're critiquing artists like Picasso and saying like you can't necessarily separate the artist and the art, like they go together in a lot of ways. And they're saying also that you can't separate the artist from the context in which they live. So one of the punchlines that they have is talking about Van Gogh, which they always pronounce Van Gogh. They say like, oh, he's always been lauded as someone that was born ahead of his time. But they're like, it's impossible. Nobody's born ahead of their time. Like that's physically impossible. So it doesn't make sense. And that's kind of a joke that they make, but it's a really important thing to be thinking of when you look at their art in itself and the fact that their art is indicative of this cultural zeitgeist that we were having at the moment. Because Nanette came out on Netflix in like 2018, and this was the time when Me Too was a large movement that was a really big buzzword culturally, and people were talking about it, whether in support or against. I think there's a lot that Nanette did and that Gadsby did within Nanette that has been really crucial and obviously catapulted them to another level of stardom as they've had a whole memoir situation about it. And now they have this art show. It's Pab-Lomatic.
Honestly, it has been so long since I watched Nanette, and I don't care about art history because it's not like at all the things that I do. That
But
I don't
it's
remember.
museum, isn't that archaeology?
Yes, yeah, for sure.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, you have no excuse then.
Yeah, no, none.
Picasso's dead. Archaeology artifacts are dead. Like, come
I'll,
on, artifacts.
I'll go dig up his body. Sorry, forgot
Yep.
about it. Anyways, yeah, no, I don't remember a lot of the issues and problems with Picasso.
Yeah, I mean, so the biggest thing that Hannah Gadsby gets at, especially, is kind of just the fact that Picasso was awful to women. It's been well documented, abusive, contentious relationships. One of the most startling quotes is a quote that he made about women as muses and lovers and kind of disposability. He said, "Every time I change wives, I should burn the last one. That way I'd be rid of them. They wouldn't be around to complicate my existence. Maybe that would bring back my youth too. You kill the woman and you wipe out the past she represents."
Oh my God.
So we can just let that sit there, marinate for a bit. I don't know how much extra we need. Picasso did have a more suspect side that I haven't read about too much, except Sally Price's book, Primitive Art in Civilized Paces. Damn, it's late. I'm
No,
sorry.
no, 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 no. I'm not judging you. I'm judging the title.
Yeah, it's from the 90s, so that title is not what we do now. She talks about how Picasso, how his Cubist perspectives kind of imitated a lot of African art that he was exposed to. So those were kind of like masks where he made them as paintings. And Price basically goes on to say that even if, you can't empirically say that Picasso copied these art pieces from the African world, it makes a big statement that Picasso is heralded as a genius for these kinds of things. And that's kind of a really interesting thing to be thinking about. Not many things that I've looked at has talked about like the colonial aspects of this kind of work. It's the elitism of the Western art scene that even though Picasso's piece is an imitation, the imitation gets more status and value than the actual original, just because the original is from, a place that's seen as quote unquote primitive. It's considered low value, and it doesn't have the power of the reputation of someone like Picasso's name behind it. So, like, as Gadsby says, nobody owns a circular Lego nude. They own a Picasso, and that's the only reason it has any value. Otherwise, you couldn't sell it at a yard sale. Um, that's a paraphrase from part of their bit.
I mean, and also like part of it is this colonialist assumption that Africans and other like peoples like can't create art and can't think of creating art on the same level that a European like Picasso can.
Mhm.
Even though obviously they're very similar.
Yeah, the imitation is quite interesting, quite
Look it up for yourself if
stark.
you're listening.
Yeah, we'll probably put it on our social medias and stuff. One of Price's quotes in her book, she says, historically, the African mask came first, and Picasso was influenced by it. But for potential visitors to an exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art, Picasso's name and fame are long-standing, and it is the African mask that is being newly introduced. The history of creation and the history of appreciation are, in this case, as in the case of modern and primitive art more generally, inversely related. Primitive art is elevated in status by being shown in the context of modern art. It's really interesting because it's kind of a fundamental question that our culture's been dealing with of like, can you separate the art from the artist? It is something that like getting to our anthropology roots. Yeah, so like, I mean, Clifford Geertz did some anthropology of like art, creativity, iconography, that kind of thing. He wrote a piece kind of about Matisse and talked about one of the quotes from Matisse where he professed the means of an art and the feeling for life that animates it are inseparable. And so art kind of exposes within the artist how connected they are to their culture. And like, you can't separate the art from the artist, nor can you separate the artist from the culture surrounding them. Matisse goes on to say, I'm unable to distinguish between the feeling I have for life and my way of expressing it. According to Hannah Gadsby, artists don't invent zeitgeist, they respond to it. So, you want to start talking about it? Share what you know, any thoughts, any.
Yeah. Okay. So this is from the Brooklyn Museum because the exhibit is at the Brooklyn Museum. Shocking.
Breaking news here. Unlivable Cultures exclusive.
Picasso said, "You can have all the perspectives at once. What a hero. But tell me, are any of those perspectives a woman's? Well, then I'm not interested," which is a quote from Hannah Gadsby. 50 years after his death, Pablo Picasso remains an artistic and cultural icon. Not only is Picasso a household name, but his artwork sells for record prices, continually asserting his status as the preeminent modern artist. It's problematic. Picasso, according to Hannah Gadsby, examines the artist's complicated legacy through a critical, contemporary, and feminist lens, even as it acknowledges his work's transformative power and lasting influence. The Brooklyn Museum's exhibition is organized with Australian comedian Hannah Gadsby, whose groundbreaking 2018 comedy special, Nanette, called out the inexcusable behavior of some of art history's most towering figures, Picasso in particular. Through in-gallery juxtapositions, accompanied by an audio tour featuring Gadsby's incisive humor and sharp critique, its Pab-lomatic showcases over 100 works, including pieces by Picasso and selections by 20th and 21st century women. The exhibition reckons with complex questions around misogyny, creativity, the art historical canon, and genius.
Nice. Okay, so are we ready for the trailer that Hannah Gadsby themselves recorded?
Yes, sure.
Oh, hello. I'm Hannah Gadsby, the Australian, the comedian, the screechy feminist TED-talking ruiner of man fun, and I'm here at the Brooklyn Museum. Nice. Why would they let a comedian loose in a world-renowned art institution? Great question. It's probably because I'm co-curating an exhibition about Pablo Picasso. That's right, the famous misogynist Picasso. I've changed. He's been dead for 50 years now. Womp womp. Nothing to do with me, I wasn't even born yet. And we thought it's about time we take a good look at him from another angle, a feminist angle, a comedic angle, fresh. Come check it out. It's Pab-lomatic, get it? At the Brooklyn Museum now, through September 24th.
Ta-da! So I figure I can go ahead and give a little context for why this is even happening, if that sounds good to you. So 2023 marks the 50-year celebration of Picasso's death. More like, but I digress. So anyway, Picasso died in 1973, and in 2023, organized by the culture ministries of Spain and France, there was around 50 exhibitions that were organized under the umbrella celebration label Celebration Picasso 1973 to 2023, which is, very creative title. It's not Pab-lomatic, if you know what I mean.
No.
So yeah, anyway, a bunch of museums across Europe and the US did some exhibitions to showcase Picasso's works to kind of celebrate his contribution to art and art history and Western patriarchal domination. The Brooklyn Museum chose to participate in this celebratory 50 exhibitions across continents kind of thing, and co-curated this collection with Hannah Gadsby based on their special of Nanette. And this one was to focus on, like you mentioned, a lot of the problematic aspects of Picasso, like misogyny, colonialism, violence, all that other stuff. So this art show, unsurprisingly, had a lot of controversy, which interestingly, I don't know, as I was reading, I just came across different things that really stood out to me. So for example, the first exhibit to kind of launch this 50-year celebration marking the occasion was curated by Paul Smith, who is a British fashion designer. And according to Art News, an article and a review of that show, Smith is best known for his vibrant and colorful designs that are paired with impeccable tailoring. And his mantra has long been classic with a twist. So anyway, the museum in Paris gave him just complete free rein to go about making a collection to mark Pablo Picasso's 50th anniversary of his death, kind of thing. There were lots of other ones. I think that's interesting to note because this isn't an art curator. This isn't some art historian. Technically, the title is actually just a fashion designer. So even though he's an artist and does all these different things, it's not entirely the same as the conventional just art curator connoisseur type. Based on what I read, he seems to kind of fit the mold, and he's just happens to be a fashion designer instead of a connoisseur slash curator. Other exhibits also kind of took the perspective that the Brooklyn Museum did. Multiple shows focused on Picasso's like contentious relationships with women and the misogyny. One focused on the artist's relationships with two separate women in his life that he featured a lot in his paintings. And there's been memoirs and biographies about the contentious relationship with them and the artist. Another examines Picasso's, quote, artist and model paintings, kind of raises the question of how are women represented in art today? And then we have Hannah Gadsby's It's Pab-Lomatic, which takes a lot more of a conversational, anti-establishment, in-your-face comedic tone that a lot of people didn't appreciate. And so it has, unsurprisingly, stirred up a lot of drama. I don't know about drama, but at least there's been a lot of talk about it. Because, I mean, lay people can get into it because they saw Nanette on Netflix, which is also why we're talking about this, because we aren't art historians or connoisseurs or anything. And then there's the actual art people that are like, but this isn't serious enough. One of the museum directors also said, in response to the controversy that's come out, Anne Pasternak, the museum's director, said, "We knew the show was going to be controversial, and if the result is that more people are engaging with the art, we think that's frankly awesome. If you want a show with hundreds of Picassos, go to Paris," she added. If you want an interesting conversation, come to Brooklyn. So I guess to kind of paint the exhibit, or at least what supposedly the experience would be, you walk into the exhibit, there's lots of paintings, there's the normal like curator cards by the paintings that give a little context, and then apparently on some of the paintings Gadsby has their own quips and little captions, almost like Twitter style. It's really interesting because a lot of it is little quips trying to be clever. Basically, so for example, some of the ones that I found was one of the quips from Gadsby is, "Art history taught me that historically women didn't have time to think thoughts. They were too busy napping naked alone in a forest." And then there's also another that was put beside the sculptor and model looking at herself, 1933. And Gadsby wrote, alternative title, "If I angle the mirror to reflect the sun, I can burn your face off. Look at my penis." The article from Art News, which was the Problems article, mentions that in the audio tour of the exhibit, Gadsby says that Picasso was a, quote, monumentally misogynistic and abusive domestic authoritarian dictator, and that he, quote, takes up too much space. To further underscore the point, Gadsby lends Picasso the nickname PP. And they're like, go ahead and laugh.
Make a joke. It's funny.
Right. They said after that, you can do the work figuring out the very unsubtle pun. It's like,
laugh. Are we not allowed to tell jokes anymore?
Apparently, telling jokes is frowned upon in this establishment. So, do you want to listen to an example of a clip from the audio tour?
Yes.
Hello, I'm Hannah Gadsby, and I'll be taking you on a tour of this exhibition about Picasso, who is, spoiler alert, dead. There will be so many more interesting facts like that one on this audio tour, so strap yourself in. To celebrate the continued deadness of a long dead man, we have decided to include some feminist works, because why would you have an exhibition with only one perspective? How boring. A word of warning, I'm Australian and it does not get better. None of it. My accent, this tour, life. I'm a comedian and I'm not a curator or a critic. I do like to criticise, however, but only through the medium of dick jokes. It's okay if you don't enjoy this. Some people will, others won't. But I think we will all live to fight another day. Except Picasso, because he's dead. Dead. He died in 1973, age 91. Look at all those facts. Look at them. We haven't even started yet. Okay, come on.
I'd enjoy that.
That's kind of slay.
Right. I'm on board. I'm not an art connoisseur or critic, so why not?
Exactly.
That seems to kind of really disrupt a lot of the aesthetic and experience that art curation typically goes for. And I think a lot of people found that to be unsettling and uncomfortable and inappropriate in a lot of ways. But I do kind of appreciate the different tone that it takes. And for example, one of the statistics for this, and this was shared by Lisa Small, who's a senior curator of the European art at Brooklyn Museum, said one of the statistics that just kind of always chills my bones is visitors spend 5 seconds looking at a label. People really don't read labels, or if they do, they read them really, really quickly. So that kind of gets at some of the inspiration behind some of Hannah Gadsby's quips for the art, is to kind of get at the point that people aren't really reading those labels. And even if it is more Twitter language style, like that is something that people read. And that is something that people took away from this, whether they had strong feelings for or against it. And Small has gone on to say in a different setting, this exhibition is an experiment in how to make a museum show with a more conversational voice. And I think in a lot of the reviews that I've read, curators that respond to the critiques and the controversy and backlash that has come from its Pab-lomatic is just like, this is an experiment to kind of engage with art in a different way and to start some conversations and debates in ways that the art community hasn't really had before. I don't know if that's true, but we don't usually have podcast episodes on other art exhibits, so something's happening.
We're experts about art history and exhibitions.
Oh yes, we have nothing better to do than make podcast episodes about the Brooklyn Museum's latest exhibitions.
Exactly. I don't know the specifics of that statistic, but like it's definitely true if you go in when you go into museums, like very, very few people read very long like texts. And so those one sentence Twitter like quips, I think, can do more to try and cut and critique Picasso in a way that people will actually sit there and comprehend and read, instead of like the long text that they would probably just pass up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's also kind of a really creative piece that I appreciate, because the Musée Picasso, to mark the 50th anniversary of Picasso's death, kind of sent out these invitations to partake in this commemoration or memorialization, whatever they want to call it. And kind of the prompt, I guess, was to consider what the artist and his work means today. And Lisa Small, who I just quoted, what the senior curator of European art, said, it seemed necessary to think about that question in terms of the culture shift brought about by feminism over the 50 years since his death, which is kind of the inspiration, obviously, for what we're talking about. And I think it's really interesting. So apparently they had quite a few like big feminist artists' work featured in the exhibit as well. One of them was by Judy Chicago, which most people know is famous for the dinner party installation from the 1970s. There was a New York Times article that quoted her. Well, this is from the article itself, but Judy Chicago said she saw in the derisive reviews confirmation of the misogyny that Gadsby confronted in the museum show and in their Nanette piece. And Judy Chicago is quoted as saying, there's a level of hysteria and hostility in some of the writing that reminds me of the hysteria that surrounded the dinner party, talking back to their installation from the 70s. So I think this does get at some of the long-lasting reverberations that are experienced when people try to shake up the art world. And I don't know how acceptable like queerness and genderqueerness and non-binary and trans identities are in the art world, but I feel like it's kind of safe to say that they're still more marginal than mainstream. But I think that is also an interesting aspect of this, is if Gadsby identifies as genderqueer, and they're also queer and on the spectrum, and they've been very vocal about how that influences their approaches, as well as the fact that they're a comedian participating and co-curating this piece kind of really shakes things up.
So I don't know obviously if Hannah Gadsby still identifies as a lesbian, I do think that there is an aspect of misogyny that is very clear in the way that the reviews are being discussed. But from my perspective as a lesbian, there's also like an element of like viewing Hannah Gadsby as like a man-hating like lesbian, and that very much impacts the way that the reviews discuss and ridicule them and this exhibit. And I think that's especially because their name is attached to it. It is uber like, I have the chance to critique this like prominent queer lesbian who has made a lot of content, and this content specifically about like criticizing men. I don't think people are being this like
Premeditated.
devious. Yeah. But I think that they are unconsciously being like, I do not like that this is a lesbian who doesn't really have an interest in men or want to interact with men in a sexual capacity, and are kind of like removed from the power of like heterosexual dynamics and men and all of those things. They still will critique and hate men and everything, and it gives these like men who do not like that about Hannah Gadsby like an excuse to be like, your criticisms of men, see, they're wrong and they're bad because you didn't do them complex enough. Yeah.
Yeah, I could just imagine people watching Nanette, I don't know, art critics, and just being like, oh my gosh, they're completely missing the point. They're completely mischaracterizing this, and like getting angry from what they were saying. And then, now that they co-curate an exhibit, they're like, okay, now they're on my home turf and I can eviscerate them. So I don't know, I could kind of see that being the case. So I definitely think you've got some good points. So yeah, did you come across any interesting things as you were doing the research, reading about different reviews and stuff?
Yeah, I felt like one, I think it would have been interesting if I could have, like, if one of us at least could have seen this in person, because we're getting mostly very one-sided views of what this exhibit is like. And like I can't be there to like judge it myself. But I do think there's a couple of things in a lot of the criticisms that I've seen that concern me, I guess. It feels like a lot of the criticism is lauded towards Hannah Gadsby as if they were the sole curator or like sole creative, and then also criticizes like the humor and the quips that Hannah Gadsby is bringing to this exhibit, which is confusing to me because I don't know. Obviously, Hannah Gadsby does have a background in art history, but I don't know who sees like a Hannah Gadsby exhibit and expects it to be serious. I also think there is an element of like, it is one of the art history or the art world being like, it is one thing for you to say these things about Picasso in your comedy show, but it is another thing for you to enter these institutions and tear down his genius in our face, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's definitely like a
Mm-hmm.
stay in your lane vibe, because I don't know, there is a lot of condescension when you're reading the reviews, and it's kind of just like, oh yeah, they can say these inflammatory remarks in their Nanette set. And so, for example, some of the things that Hannah Gadsby said, the history of Western art is just men painting women like they're flesh vases for their dick flowers. That's one of my favorites. And you quoted some of them just in the beginning from the Brooklyn Mets kind of press release announcement about it. And there's a lot of different articles that quote some of the things that Hannah Gadsby has said just in relation to Picasso. Another one of my favorites is, nobody owns a circular Lego nude. They own a Picasso, which just, I don't know who thinks of a circular Lego nude, but that is kind of what it looks like. Anyway, yeah, the whole stay in your lane kind of thing. It's like you can make these funny pop cultural remarks, but the second you step in a museum, like, we're going to tear you to shreds. That was kind of a interesting vibe to take. And there also has been some kind of, not quite indifference. I'm trying to think of the right word. Ambivalence, I guess, like even from the artists and different people. So one of the things that I read was actually one of the artists who was featured in the It's Pab-Lomatic exhibit, Betty Tompkins, who was the creator of the Fuck Painting #6, recalls, and this is an article from The Guardian, and Betty Tompkins is quoted as talking about when her professor used to share with the class tales of Picasso's mistresses and the arrests and the failed marriages and the drinking. And Betty Tompkins says, "It was the most mesmerizing art class I ever had. That said, I think without a doubt he was a great artist, despite being a horrible human being." And so, like, I don't know, there is kind of this ambivalence in the art community, art history, like artist, just spheres of the ambivalence of like, yeah, this is a great artist, but also he was awful, but he was also foundational. So like tomato, tomato. I don't know. I don't want to like tear them
He
to
sucks, but
shreds.
he wrote Harry Potter.
Right. The art news review also just goes on to basically, I don't want to say discredit or invalidate what Gatsby's doing, but kind of diminish it and say, like, Picasso's been heavily scrutinized and critiqued before. They mentioned that Robert Hughes called him a, quote, walking scrotum. He was also called an egoist by artist Francois Guillot. I don't know how to pronounce that. Apologies. But who is one of Picasso's former lovers, and kind of just like traces that of like, oh, well, people have had problems with him before. So obviously Hannah Gadsby is doing nothing new or interesting. Yet let's spend a 1,000 word article on reviewing how much of a Pab-Low this exhibit is. One of the New York Times reviewers called the exhibition essentially a light amusement. He added that it backs away from close looking for the affirmative comforts of social justice themed pop culture. But then we also get similar critiques from art historians that we see across very different fields and very different arenas. So it kind of reminds me, like in our episode with Dr. Fraser about Black studies, there was all this like, oh, well, we shouldn't be focusing on racism. We should be focusing on these things. These are or we shouldn't focus on slavery. We should be focused on these big things that are issues at the university now. And that kind of stuff. This art historian, Robert Storr, said, "The museum has better things to do than to make the case for women artists by beating up on Picasso. Being anti-Picasso is so easy. It doesn't get to any of the underlying structural issues. What's needed is a critique of institutional sexism, not the targeting of one long dead artist who's no longer making art."
Okay. I think it's like also just like false to not view like the platforming of Picasso in, like a positive light as part of that institutional
Right.
misogyny.
Though I do want to mention, like, there are some reviewers that actually liked it. So one piece in The Economist said, "There's something refreshing about a show that doesn't let Picasso preen on his pedestal. Many of his works here feature an artist in a studio with a comely nude model, a tableau that feels at once charged and vampiric. The contrast between Picasso's pert breasts and curvy hips and the female bodies created by female artists feels potent." And I think that's also an interesting contrast to show. Like in this piece, presumably, you have depictions of women naked by Picasso and then by an actual other woman who has a very different gaze. There have been interesting responses from actual people that go and look at the exhibit. New York's timepiece quoted one visitor. She said that it's the violence that's inherent in his work that is getting to me and making me cry. It's very pointedly through an angry lens, which I think is appropriate. And she said, talking about the exhibit. So I think, apart from being an art critic, I do think going to an exhibit like that could be pretty stirring, hypothetically. But all that being said, I think it was very smart on the part of the Brooklyn Museum because it's gotten them a lot of attention. Supposedly, people lined up out the door at the Brooklyn Museum when it first opened in June of 2023 and increased the general admission by 51% just in that weekend, while they're sitting there being like, oh, we want this to be an experimental exhibit to spark debates. They're also raking in a lot of money and media. So that is something on their hand that is pretty smart. I did want to mention, so I found a Jezebel article that reviewed it from a feminist lens. So the title of that review didn't go for any jokes. They just said, Hannah Gadsby's Pab-lomatic is not the feminist achievement it wants to be. And they had some interesting things to say because they were saying a lot of this, well, actually, they were saying a lot of the same things that other reviews said, but they were pointedly trying to take a feminist angle of like, even from a feminist perspective, this isn't good. So, for example, one of the parts of the article, they say, the depth and complexity of the feelings I detected in the Pearl Stein and Gorilla Girl pieces at the front of the show are reproduced normal time. But the overall curation doesn't provide a clear or captivating way to engage with those feelings. Doing so meaningfully would be a colossal task, and a quote from Gadsby emblazoned on the wall at the entrance of It's Pab-lomatic says as much. And Gadsby said, I think it's futile to engage directly in a conversation about whether we should cancel Picasso, not least because it is impossible. He's already happened to us. Plus, Picasso doesn't care. He's dead. The conclusion of that Jezebel article says the curators of It's Pab-lomatic have been receptive to the backlash, saying it is igniting an important debate over the artist. But I don't think Picasso's legacy is what's up for debate among their critics. Rather, it's whether or not enough care was taken in gathering women artists in his shadow to demonstrate how big it could be cast. So as we're wrapping up, I want to take seriously these concerns that were mentioned, these critiques, and the ways in which people found problems or gaps in It's Pab-lomatic. But I also want to kind of take a lighter approach to it, a more, I don't know, playful approach like Gadsby does. And I think a really interesting point of entry into this is thinking about Jack Halberstam's The Queer Art of Failure and zero in on Halberstam's work with a silly archive and low theory and how they're going about theorizing how failure can be queer and how the counter-hegemonic, the unsuccessful, the anarchic can be queer and envision new queer utopias, envision alternatives, and also just difference. Halberstam says, low theory is a model of thinking that I extract from Stuart Hall's famous notion that theory is not an end unto itself, but a detour en route to something else. And I think it's really interesting to kind of play with this kind of thinking and talking about Gadsby's It's Pab-lomatic, because even if, you know, it didn't have these hard-hitting critiques or it didn't nail the nuance and complexity that people desired, it's still en route to something, and there's something powerful about that, at least in my view. Halberstam also says, Hall goes on to argue that Gramsci was not aiming higher and missing his political target. Instead, like Hall himself, he was aiming low in order to hit a broader target. Here we can think about how low theory as a mode of accessibility, but we might also think about it as a kind of theoretical model that flies below the radar, that is assembled from eccentric texts and examples, and that refuses to confirm the hierarchies of knowing that maintain the high in high theory. And I think this is a crucial aspect of the discussion that we're having, because Gadsby's intervention in the art scene when it comes to It's Pab-lomatic and Pablo Picasso is a very unserious engagement with it, and people take issue because it doesn't maintain the quote unquote high in high theory that Halberstam is referencing. And it doesn't give the same credence to the hierarchies of the art world and the hierarchies of knowledge and connoisseurship that people expect of, these art exhibits. And so Halberstam says low theory might constitute the name for a counter-hegemonic form of theorizing, the theorization of alternatives within an undisciplined zone of knowledge production. And I would just echo what I just said. Maybe it is a more undisciplined zone of knowledge production, calling Pablo Picasso PP or referencing, silly jokes and Twitter-like captions. That's kind of a thought that I want to leave us with. Some may agree with this application of Halberstam's work on low theory and silly archives, and some may not. I'm trying to be playful with this reference and, hold it with open hands. It may work, it may not, but that's something that I think really adds some texture to this conversation and how we may think about Gadsby's It's Pab-lomatic and other interventions into the very well established and often stodgy art world. So yeah, thank you for listening.
Go take a nap or eat some food or something.
Yeah, go take care of yourself. Give yourself a hand. Give yourself some credit for breathing and being alive, because like Hannah Gadsby said, it's a lot of work and it doesn't get better.